everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the early Cold War and specifically what created this period in time in which we see two superpowers emerge, the United States and the Soviet Union following World War II. And with that, the proliferation of nuclear arms, large standing armies, and two very different ideologies, the communism of the USSR and the capitalist economic system of the United States, and the interplay of those two and how they're going to influence global events for the next 40 years to come. I think an interesting way to look at the various viewpoints about the Cold War. One way to do that is to see two cartoons. In this case, you have the same elements and figures, but relative size and the way they're juxtaposed is going to create two very different points of view. So on the left, we see the big, powerful Soviet bear, and it seems to literally be coming across and taking as much land as it can globally. And we have a tiny little Uncle Sam here who can't really offer any kind of defense in the sense he's being overpowered. And we have the opposite viewpoint, which is that the United States is the aggressor and constantly doing things to thwart the power of the Soviet Union, which you can see in this tiny little bear. But both of these demonstrate that both nations had significant influence in the world at different times, and that ultimately the actions they took were often to undermine the influence of the other. So the origins of the Cold War begin about 5 years before World War II ends. And they begin at a time when the United States wasn't even involved in World War II. In late 1940, early 1941, England is in a terrible place in that it is really the last nation standing in Europe that is ultimately opposed to the Third Reich. Germany, by December of 1940, has managed to bomb London. It has taken control of France, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Finland, Poland, and other areas of Europe. And the United States isn't involved in the war directly. What it's doing at best is attempting to aid Great Britain in her struggle through things like the Lend-Lease Act. But Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the President of the United States, they're going to be having conversations. They're going to be talking with each other, looking at what the world could be after the war is over. It was sort of seen as almost inevitable at some point that the United States would be entering the war by early 1941. But the principles they were looking at were ones in which a new world order could exist, much like Wilson's 14 points. But there are some significant differences. So FDR is going to speak about the need for free elections, which was not seen in the Soviet Union once their revolution came, and certainly wasn't possible in the totalitarian regimes of the fascist Italy and Germany of the day. You're also going to see a call for no military alliances. Much like the start of World War I, World War II is going to rely on the various powers working together for some military purpose. The Axis powers of Japan, Italy, and Germany, the non-aggression pact that Germany is going to sign with Stalin in 1939, trying to preclude those from happening again. And the last piece, which was not a favorite of Winston Churchill's and some of the other nations that will ultimately sign this Atlantic Charter, but one that will come to fruition, is to end the spheres of influence. Or another way of speaking about it is the idea that we're not going to colonize anymore, that the Western world is not going to be exploiting parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, China for its own material gain. And this is significant because the United States, by the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, is doing this very thing. At the beginning of the 20th century, it's open door policy in China. So the U.S. is guilty of this phenomenon just as much as France or Great Britain was. Um, at the end of World War I, there was a call to end colonization then, and it fell on deaf ears. In fact, Germany's colonies in Africa and elsewhere were simply handed over to France and Great Britain. So these are going to be points that FDR believes have to happen in a new world order, and they will all come to fruition. But FDR is going to die in 1945. And so the real work that's going to come trying to heal the world and build a new world order is going to fall to his vice president, Harry Truman. The Atlantic Charter is also the precursor to what was the UN Charter. In March of 1945, the United Nations will be created at something called the San Francisco Conference, and that ultimately is going to lay out how the world exists today, in fact. FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union will meet many times starting in 1942 through 1945. Once Germany attacks the USSR in 1942, Stalin will come on board with the Allies. And together, they're going to come up with their plan to defeating Germany and the other Axis powers. But as the war is drawing to a close, especially in Europe, the United Kingdom and the US have made their amphibious incursion into France in June of 1944, and they're going to continue to push eastward towards Berlin. The Soviets, on the other hand, are going to have to push Germany out of their own country and then push them back to Germany going westward. But as time goes on, the areas of Europe that are freed from Germany, the question is, well, now they're occupied by yet another army. What's going to happen to them? Well, for the US and Great Britain, the attitude was that this was to provide policing and rebuilding and structure for places that might not have a government anymore. But what was seen by the Soviets was that they were doing sort of a whole-scale takeover of government, relatively little rebuilding, and in some cases, actually taking equipment, material, and even people back to the Soviet Union to be utilized there. And in September of 1945, Winston Churchill will speak about this phenomenon that ultimately Germany, once it has surrendered, is divided in half, east and west. In the eastern portion, if you continue to draw a line down southward through Europe, ultimately that was the land that the Soviet army occupied and didn't seem like it was going to leave anytime soon. And he spoke about the idea that there was really an iron curtain that had been dropped, and that which lied west of the Iron Curtain was a place of freedom and capitalism and free markets, and what lied east of it was totalitarianism on an ever greater scale. By August of 1945, President Truman wants to bring the war in the Pacific to a close. And he's struggling to do that in part because this is really part of the war that the U.S. takes on itself. Once Japan has defeated British troops and French troops in late 1940, early 41, and certainly U.S. troops, it's really going to be the U.S. who's going to have to island hop and go literally reconquer the Pacific. But Japan has not surrendered, even with the capture of the island of Iwo Jima. Soviet Union would not join in America's fight against Japan. It always argued that it could not handle a two-front war. And so in August, Truman is faced with a dilemma. His experts believe it's going to take 250,000 men at least to be the first party to attempt to conquer Japan. And that seems like it's going to have a high rate of injury and death. The death toll in the Pacific was far greater than what it ever was in Europe. And Truman was also offered another alternative, which was to utilize what was the fruits of the Manhattan Project, which was the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb is utilized in August of 1945 against the city of Hiroshima in Japan. It was an industrialized area, and the belief was that if you could knock out Japan's industrial capacity, the nation would surrender. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so 3 days later, yet another industrial city, Nagasaki, was chosen, and a second bomb was dropped. And at that point, Japan did surrender. Although Winston Churchill knew about the program and was intimately involved in knowing the success of the program, Stalin was not. He knew that there was development and research, but he, amongst many people, was quite shocked in August of 1945 when this bomb was not unleashed once, but twice. The Soviet Union will actually, through its efforts of spying, will get the technology of the atomic bomb in 1949. But Truman never articulated to Stalin or to anyone else that the United States didn't have a huge store of these weapons, that they'd really created four. One that was tested in the deserts out and around Los Alamos in New Mexico, two that were utilized against Japan, and basically a fourth one in reserve. But being able to unleash this power, considering the number of conferences, the number of times that these countries had met, and that the Soviets had no idea that the US had adopted and obtained this capacity for a new type of warfare, was something that is ultimately going to create the true division between these two nations. So Truman has got really three jobs, three things that he is going to have to contend with in the decade following World War II. And the first one is how to rebuild Europe. Europe is going to need, literally, some cities had to be entirely rebuilt, regardless of where they were. You had German cities that had been facing aerial bombardment from the Allies for years. You had some countries that were relatively untouched, like the area certainly northward and in and around Paris. You had some nations where there had been an occupation, but not a lot of destructive capacity, like Norway or Sweden. But nevertheless, the goal was to make sure that these countries were going to be stable. And George Marshall, who was Secretary of State following the war and had also served as a general during World War II, he believed that the greatest threat, what would enable communism to thrive and grow in Europe, would be countries that did not have economic choices. In a sense, had seen capitalism fail. That was one of the arguments, certainly, with the Russian Revolution in 1917, was World War I demonstrated a failure of capitalism. And there was fear that this would happen again. But what to do about the Soviet Union? It's contained in some ways, but could its power be constrained? Could its influence be stopped at this Iron Curtain? And certainly that was the hope. George F. Kennan was an expert in Russian life and politics. He had worked for the State Department in Russia throughout the 1930s, and he believed that the US had to contain Soviet influence. And part of that was going to be to prop up and restabilize economically and hopefully politically much of Western Europe. But that containment policy might have to go on in other parts of the globe as well. But in 1946, 1947, there was lots of political unrest. You had contentious elections in places like France, but you also had what were essentially civil wars taking place in Turkey and in Greece with communist and capitalist factions. And so Truman is going to find himself by 1947 literally having to articulate a philosophy of international politics that the United States really hadn't done before. We had this Monroe Doctrine. It was certainly developed in the early 20th century with the Corollary by Theodore Roosevelt, and we begin speaking about policing power. But the idea that the United States would economically give large amounts of aid to countries so that they could have stable elections and economically prosper, this hadn't been done before. And so the Truman Doctrine, it came out of a result of the issues in Greece and Turkey, but ultimately will be a vision for supporting nations all over the globe that are facing the threat of communism. And it's important that at this point we're looking at communism and totalitarianism ultimately as one and the same. We also have to create an entire bureaucracy of the government dedicated to these issues. So beyond simply the Department of State, which we've had since the inception of our Constitution, we're going to create a National Security Administration to deal with threats within the United States. We're going to have a CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency is going to be responsible for assessing the threats in nations beyond the United States. We no longer have a Department of War, which ultimately really only existed with large amounts of money and influence during times of war. We're going to have a Department of Defense with a large standing army. Selective service, which was utilized in World War I and World War II, will be kept on past World War II until the late 1960s. And every young man who was physically capable between the age of 18 and 21 was expected to go and serve 2 years in the military. And that might be on a base in Germany. It could also be something stateside. Ultimately, some of those people will find themselves fighting in places like Vietnam by the mid 1960s. But the belief is that containing communism is going to take military presence. It's also going to take economic influence, and ultimately what will be known as collective security. So there are going to be nations that can't have a standing army after World War II, like Germany, like Japan. Those are things that had to be agreed to when they were defeated in 1945. And so the United States is going to be providing whatever military support they need. And to do that elsewhere as well. There were nations that didn't really have a standing military, or their standing military had been defeated in the early years of World War II. And so the United States will propose something called NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And ultimately, again, this goes back to earlier foreign policy. With the Monroe Doctrine, we stated we would not be involved in European affairs. Even the Corollary, our policing power, is supposed to be contained to the Americas. So how do we justify that the U.S. military is going to be involved in other parts of the world outside the Americas? And the idea was that NATO were nations that were surrounding the Atlantic Ocean, and that the United States might be on the other side of that ocean, but that commonality was something that could create for these nations a collective security against any kind of Soviet pressure influence. Not to be outdone, the Soviets will create their own version called the Warsaw Pact. And you can see in our image here, although countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, the Soviet military stayed there in those countries well into the 50s. Even when it left, it was only because you had communist governments and they had established militaries and totalitarian regimes that were economically supported by the Soviet Union. But the NATO organization still exists today. It includes a lot more countries than it originally did. But again, it was this notion of collective security. The second test that Harry Truman will face in his presidency will come out of one of the decisions made towards the end of World War II. At the Yalta Conference, they decided not only how would the major powers, the Allies, attempt to police and rebuild what areas they could of Europe, but also they looked at Germany specifically and the capital city of Berlin. It was understood that certainly by 1944 that with the push on either side by the Soviets to the east and the United States and the United Kingdom and France to the west, that they were all going to converge on Berlin, that they were hoping to capture Adolf Hitler and his high command, prosecute those people, and bring an end to the war in Europe. In actual fact, Hitler kills himself. Actually, many of his inner circle do, others run away, but there are some who are held accountable in the years to come. But that capital city and the country of Germany itself, the notion is it can't be left to its own devices, which is ultimately what happened at the armistice at the end of World War I. So, how do we rebuild Germany? How do we essentially wipe out whatever fascist sentiment may still exist there? And so the view was one, that Germany itself would be equally shared, that the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviets would all have zones of Russia. And ultimately, what becomes East Germany is the Russian zone, as you can see on our map. But within Berlin, within East Germany is the city of Berlin. And Berlin itself was divided into 4 zones: a Soviet zone, an American zone, a French zone, and a British zone, which early on was not too controversial. But by 1948, you had part of a city that was free and capitalist existing in a communist nation. And Stalin wanted all of Berlin. In his mind, the idea that part of Berlin could be a place where people could come and go, that capitalism was alive and well, these were problematic to the ultimate goals of communism, which is worldwide revolution by the proletariat. And so he had to gain control of the city. And his attempt to do that was simply to cut off the roads, the railroads, the power, the water supply into the western part of Berlin. When he does this in 1948, his belief is that within a few weeks or maybe a month, that portion of the city will simply capitulate and give up. But that isn't what happens. They don't have to give up because the United States says that they will initiate an airlift. And for over a year, the United States landed a plane every minute at least one of their airports in order to bring in petroleum, food, any other necessary supplies, to the tune of billions of dollars. And it didn't seem any sign of ending even a year after this process began. Ultimately, Stalin will concede that the US has the money and the resources and is willing to spend them in order to attempt to outshift him. And so he simply gives up. In 1949, the power comes back on, the roads go unblocked. But it is not because he has entirely given up on using Soviet influence against the United States and its allies, but that he is going to take his influence elsewhere. The third test that Harry Truman will face is that of the Korean War. At the end of World War II, there were many Japanese possessions. So there were areas that they had colonized starting in the early 20th century, well through the 1930s, places like Korea, for instance. And those countries now were seeking autonomy, but they, like Europe, had to be rebuilt. And again, at the conferences that the 3 powers had at the end of World War II, they had decided that Korea itself would be divided at something called the 38th parallel, which pretty much bisects this portion of the country. And to the north, the Soviets would be focused on rebuilding. To the south, that would be the U.S. interest, with the agreement that by 1950, that both nations ultimately would leave, having left a stabilized place. But In 1948, there was an election in the southern portion, and the government was a capitalist, pro US government. And that was not something that the North wanted. There was a lot of influence by China in that area. China, if you remember, in 1947 had its communist revolution under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the financial support of the Soviet Union. And the capitalist government of Chiang Kai shek flees to Taiwan. And the United States had hoped that if they put enough money and support into Korea, that it would not become a communist nation. But unfortunately, all that happened was you had two different countries trying to coexist within the same space. The United States wants to help South Korea, especially when they come under attack from the North. Ultimately, we have a civil war going on. And the US is struggling because they feel that, one, this should be an issue that's going to be resolved by the United Nations. And the United Nations Security Council was the original 5 big countries, if you will, that attempted to found the UN. They were France, the United Kingdom, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. But the United States, since 1947, had not recognized those representing China because they represented communist China, not the capitalist China that had existed in 1945. And the Soviet Union was unhappy that the US wouldn't recognize the Chinese government. And ultimately, when it was put to a vote, it was a vote 3-2. That the UN would send peacekeepers, they would send support, and that the United States would send troops as well. And what transpired was a 2-year war in which it seemed that there would be no end. China, in particular, had offered a lot of soldiers and military support. The US, in less than 2 years, had had more than 40,000 lives lost. And people questioned how long this was going to have to continue. Was this yet another phase, essentially, of World War II or the beginnings of a World War III? The head of the U.S. Army at that point was a man named Douglas MacArthur. And General MacArthur, who had spent much of World War II working towards the recapture of the Philippines from Japan, he became the Governor General of Japan. Once it was captured and surrendered in 1945, and was considered in many ways militarily sort of an expert on the psyche of Asiatic peoples, obviously based on the biases of the day. But he argued to Truman that the easiest ways to resolve this problem was to use an atomic weapon, and specifically use it against China. He believed that if the bomb had been used against China, that Mao Zedong would not have had the power, the ability to continue the fight. That devastation would also send a warning to the Soviets not to play games with the United States and not to support communist insurgencies where they were trying to gain ground in other parts of the globe. Harry Truman spoke about and wrote about in the later years of his life that he believed that he had done the right thing for the American people in the 2 atomic bombings. But he also acknowledged that no matter what, lives were lost. And in such a horrific way that hopefully these weapons would never be utilized again. And he certainly was not going to do this to end this conflict. Douglas MacArthur decided that he was going to take the issue to the American people. He wrote an open letter, which was published in newspapers across the country, and laid it out for the American people that he had a solution that the president wasn't willing to utilize. And Truman had to fire him. And there were people kind of shocked that the president would fire someone who was considered so important to the US military. But it also signaled that the United States had limits, and there was a sort of a moral line we were not willing to cross. And we hoped the Soviets wouldn't cross either. In 1953, with the coming of a new administration, an armistice was signed. That still exists today. at this 38th parallel, there are border guards, tens of thousands of landmines. There is a North Korea that is a communist totalitarian regime, and there is the capitalist South. Um, and in 60 years, this has remained unchanged. So, with Truman leaving office, the United States is having an open election. They need a new candidate for the Democratic Party, the new candidate for the Republican Party, and the Republicans will prevail because they will put Dwight D. Eisenhower, the hero of the Normandy invasion, and really closing out the war in Europe. Eisenhower, like other generals who've been president, such as Grant and George Washington himself, did not have a political career before he ascended to the presidency. And I would argue that you really want to look at Eisenhower and his leadership, especially towards the end of his 2 years in office, as in many ways modeling the standard set by George Washington, our first president. Eisenhower inherits both the successes and the failures of Truman's foreign policy. His Secretary of State will be a man named John Foster Dulles. And John Foster Dulles is going to be very hawkish, meaning that he believes that military strength, whether it's utilized or not, but just the presence of it, is a necessary component of foreign policy. And really, two ideas are going to thrive in the Eisenhower administration. The first one is that the U.S. needs to intervene where it can, hopefully economically versus militarily, in different parts of the world, wherever communism might take hold. And they did this because of what they believe to be the domino theory, that in a nation like China, for instance, once it had its communist revolution, it was very easy to foment revolution in North Korea. We'll see throughout the 50s and the 60s a communist revolution take place in Vietnam, later Laos and Cambodia. So there was this belief, and it did seem to hold true, at least in Southeast Asia, that if communism could take hold in one area, the neighboring countries would also fall to it as well. The other piece of this diplomacy is going to be based in that of massive retaliation. And that ultimately means that whatever our foe possesses, whether that is the number of soldiers that currently serve in the military, the number of nuclear bombs or warheads, that we will always match them. And we will have more than enough to destroy the world over several times, namely because that is what is going to discourage the Soviets from ever unleashing any of that firepower or its large military against the United States. The U.S. is going to have a standing army of over 500,000 men throughout the 1950s. It'll be well over 1 million men beginning in the 1960s. And we've never done that before. The United States, at its largest peacetime military, was a standing army of about 20,000 men prior to World War I. So the idea that we would have men who would be stationed across the globe at the ready and have a nuclear arsenal that could, destroy the Soviet Union hundreds of times over was really a departure from foreign policy of the past. In order to make sure that we didn't see the dominoes fall, if you can imagine them being stood up on a table and you push one and the others will collapse along with it, we gave billions of dollars of aid. Originally, we gave money to France because Vietnam was their colonial possession, what was known as Indochina. By 1954, we're going to realize that trying to stabilize that colonial relationship is not going to work. And that ultimately, perhaps the people of Vietnam need to be autonomous. But in doing so, we're going to actually help foment a coup and place a political leader, at least in the capitalist southern portions of Vietnam, who is pro-U.S., but there in the north will be Ho Chi Minh, who had been a communist leader. throughout not only the colonial period, but in the independence period to follow, and eventually become the communist leader of all of Vietnam. There will be also the Indochina colony will be broken up. So what will become Vietnam's neighbors of Cambodia and Laos are also created in this time period. All of these countries by 1975 will have Marxist governments. And then the last thing, in order to have strength at home, the United States is going to invest billions of dollars in a massive infrastructure project. The federal highways, if you travel down I-77, 85, 95, those were all born out of the Federal Highway and Defense Act of 1956. Eisenhower had driven across the country several times during his life, and it was always a long, arduous journey. And one of the things he noticed in the capture of Germany in 1945 was that in the 1930s, a very impressive highway system called the Autobahn had been built in Germany. And it wasn't built simply so Germans could have very convenient ways to travel from place to place, but ultimately Hitler created it so he would have a steady pipeline in order to move troops and material to the far corners of Germany in order to conquer his neighbors. And so the United States is going to take that idea and begin to build a highway system that can support a large military, but not for the purpose of conquest, but defense. If a city like Washington, D.C. should receive a nuclear strike, it would take days to perhaps get aid without a system of moving men and material quickly. So the highways, next time you drive on them, take a look. The interstate system is, usually at least 3 lanes in width. The bridge abutments are 23 feet or more in height. That is to move the biggest equipment that the military has, including planes. So all of these things are going to be part of Eisenhower's attempt to strengthen the United States in terms of foreign policy, but provide greater security at home as well. Communism was seen as something in the 1940s and the early 1950s as being an issue in Europe, in Southeast Asia. But by the mid-1950s, there's a realization that communism could really survive anywhere, in part because the Communist Playbook, if you take the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx's work, he lays out that there is this proletariat that is controlled by the bourgeoisie for its own ends, but that the proletariat is much larger in number, and if it could unite together, it could have a revolution and take control. He believed things like private property, banking, religion were all things that were created by the capitalist West for the purposes of ultimately controlling the poor and the underclass. And so the goal of a communist revolution is not simply to have one, in that you have the Russian Revolution of 1916, 1917, that the end goal of that is not that revolution alone, but that will then build the strength and a nation that can create revolutions in the name of communism elsewhere. And so by 1953, you're going to see that the United States is in a position where there are parts of the world where there is a tremendous underclass. And that may have been caused by past colonization. It might simply be a byproduct of something like we see in Guatemala, where the United States owned large amounts of land. U.S. businesses controlled it, especially when they were involved with the purposes of agricultural production. You had something akin to sharecropping existing. And so nations like Honduras, Ecuador, Guatemala are going to see themselves as really owned and influenced by the United States. Cuba as well. And this is part of the reason why there's a revolution there in 1959. But in 1953, there will be an elected president, Jacobo Guzman, who will attempt to nationalize the land. He will ask his Congress to pass a law that will forbid non Guatemalans from owning land. Well, the United Fruit Company, you know them as Chiquita today, they owned 40% of the land in Guatemala. They had a fruit empire across the globe, and they weren't going to just let that go. And actually lobbied for the CIA to, in some way, support their continued land ownership. And ultimately, the CIA will participate in a coup d'etat to replace President Guzman. This will also happen in Iran. It's how the Shah will be put on the throne in 1954. And it's also what will happen in South Vietnam as well. How this is connected to Cuba? Well, Cuba, since 1898, although an independent country, had been economically controlled by the United States. Much of the land and businesses in Cuba were U.S. companies. And they had always basically dictated who was the government of Cuba. In 1959, that was the Batista regime, which was quite brutal to the Cuban people. People who spoke out or criticized the Batista government were imprisoned without trial. There was a lot of violence used against those who attempted to check that power. And in 1959, there will be a communist revolution led by Fidel and Raul Castro. And it will be a communist revolution that takes the United States by surprise. They were prepared, they thought, what was going on in somewhere like Guatemala, because you had a socialist government, it was freely elected, and they had kind of mapped out what it wanted to do. Whereas the Castro brothers decided that they weren't going to run in an election. They were not going to, in any way, through the regular channels of political power, attempt to contest with the Batista government. And they've always argued for two reasons. One, they believed if that by some chance they won, they didn't think they could, but if they did, that the US would do what they had done in Guatemala and simply they'd be deposed. And so the idea with this well-planned but very covert communist revolution was that ultimately they would be in power, had gotten rid of the Batista government. Batista will flee Cuba before the US can ever intervene. And they were correct. Since 1959, Cuba has been a communist country and it's a totalitarian regime. But Cuba really is a result. It is the lesson that communists, at least in the Americas, learned, that attempting to be open about their views was not necessarily going to get them into power that would be long lasting, but attempting to revolt quickly without US influence was the way that they would achieve success. It also was a great failure for the United States because now there was Soviet influence 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And the Soviets were very happy, especially early on, to support the Castro regime with food and military aid and money. And in doing so will be a challenge in our backyard that we were not expecting. So we are going to stop our lesson here for today. In 8.2, we're going to pick up coming out of the Castro Revolution in Cuba, looking at how the U.S. is going to attempt to gain redress and try to take Cuba back and fail to do so, but also how we bring ourselves to the brink of nuclear Armageddon and how we move towards something that is less tense and a more détente period by the late 1960s.